In the ancient world, taxes were not a line item in a budget. They were a declaration of dominance. Before elections, before constitutions, before modern states, taxation was how rulers made their authority real. To be taxed was to be ruled. To collect taxes was to control land, labor, and survival itself. This is why early tax systems were never subtle. They were direct, physical, and impossible to ignore. Ancient governments did not ask citizens politely to contribute. They measured fields, counted animals, inventoried grain, and tracked households. Taxation was embedded into daily life because it had to be. Rulers lacked standing armies, professional bureaucracies, or stable currencies. What they had was land, and the ability to take a portion of what it produced. This made taxation the core technology of power. Whoever controlled tax collection controlled food supplies, military funding, and political loyalty. A king who could not tax was not a king for long. He could not feed soldiers, maintain roads, or suppress rebellion. Taxation was the difference between authority and collapse. This is why ancient rulers obsessed over tax records. Clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, knotted strings, these were not accounting tools. They were instruments of rule, recording who owed what was equivalent to mapping power across a territory. But taxation also created risk. Take too little, and the state weakened. Take too much, and society cracked. Ancient rulers learned quickly that taxes were not just about revenue. They were about balance. A functioning tax system had to extract surplus without killing production. This is where many states failed. Taxation without sensitivity punished farmers first. When peasants lost seed grain, next year's harvest disappeared. When land was overtaxed, it was abandoned. When families could not pay, they sold children, fell into bondage, or fled. Revenue spiked briefly, then collapsed. Ancient taxation was therefore a constant experiment in control. Rulers adjusted rates, shifted burdens, and rewrote laws not out of fairness, but survival. Empires that learned to tax sustainably expanded. Those that didn't fragmented under their own weight. This is why taxation shaped political identity long before ideology did. People didn't ask who their ruler was. They asked who took their grain. In the ancient world, sovereignty wasn't declared in palaces. It was collected in fields. And the empires that mastered taxation didn't just rule longer. They defined the world. Before money ruled empires, land did. And before income taxes, sales taxes, or customs duties, there was grain. In ancient societies, land was the economy. It produced food, labor, population, and power. Whoever controlled land controlled survival. So the earliest tax systems were built around a simple logic. Measure the land, estimate its yield, and take a share. This was not theoretical. It was brutally practical. States sent officials into fields to measure plots, mark boundaries, and calculate expected harvests. Taxes were assessed not in abstract numbers, but in sacks of barley, wheat, rice, or maize. Grain became the universal unit of value because it could feed soldiers, workers, and cities. This is how the first tax empires formed. In Mesopotamia, temples and palaces became massive grain warehouses. Farmers delivered a portion of their harvest as obligation. In return, the state offered protection, irrigation, and famine relief, at least in theory. Grain taxes allowed rulers to stockpile surplus, smoothing out bad harvests and funding armies. Egypt perfected this model. The Nile's predictable floods made land measurement and yield estimation astonishingly precise. Pharaohs taxed not people, but productivity. Grain flowed into royal granaries, then back out to feed laborers, bureaucrats, and soldiers. This wasn't generosity, it was logistics. China followed a similar path. Dynasties rose and fell based on their ability to assess land accurately and tax it fairly. When records were honest, the system worked. When corruption crept in, peasants were crushed, rebellions followed, and dynasties collapsed. Land-based taxation had one major advantage. It was hard to hide. You could conceal silver, you could flee cities. But land stayed where it was. Fields could be measured, harvests observed, grain counted. This made agricultural taxes reliable and dangerous, because when states became desperate, they squeezed land harder. Overtaxing land didn't just hurt farmers, it undermined the entire system. Fields were abandoned, soil degraded, production dropped. What looked like a short-term revenue fix became long-term collapse. Ancient empires learned this lesson repeatedly. Sustainable taxation required restraint. The moment rulers treated land as an infinite resource, decline followed. This is why land taxes defined early empires. They created stability when managed wisely and catastrophe when abused. Before banks, before bonds, before budgets, power rested in grain stores. And empires rose and fell on how they filled them. As empires expanded beyond their original lands, taxation took on a new form. Rulers no longer relied only on what their own soil could produce. They turned outward. This is where tribute emerged. Tribute was taxation at a distance, wealth extracted from conquered peoples in exchange for not being destroyed again. It could be paid in gold, silver, livestock, slaves, manufactured goods, or soldiers. What mattered was not the form, but the message. Submission had a price. For conquering states, tribute solved a fundamental problem. Armies were expensive. Occupation was costly. Permanent administration over vast territories was often impossible. Tribute allowed empires to extract value without fully integrating new lands. It was efficient, and it was fragile. The Assyrians mastered terror-based tribute. Cities that surrendered paid regularly. Cities that resisted were erased. Tribute flowed upward, funding further campaigns. But the system depended on fear. The moment the empire weakened, tribute stopped, and the illusion of control shattered. Persia refined the model. Instead of constant terror, it built a network of satrapies, regional administrations responsible for collecting fixed tribute quotas. Some regions paid in silver, others in goods. The genius of the system was predictability. Tribute became routine rather than punitive. Rome pushed tribute to its limits. Conquered provinces were taxed to fund legions stationed elsewhere. Wealth flowed from the periphery to the center. Roads, aqueducts, and cities were built. But the burden remained heavy. Provinces that paid too much stagnated. Those that paid too little invited crackdowns. Tribute changed the economics of empire. Conquest became profitable only if extraction exceeded military cost. This incentivized expansion until the empire grew too large to manage efficiently. At that point, tribute turned from asset to liability. Revolts became common. Corruption flourished. Local elites squeezed. Populations to meet imperial demands. Productivity fell. Resistance hardened. Empires often responded by increasing tribute, accelerating collapse. Tribute systems also distorted political priorities. Rulers focused on maintaining revenue streams rather than improving local economies. Long-term development mattered less than short-term extraction. Provinces became mines, not communities. This is why tribute-based empires faced constant instability. They relied on dominance rather than integration. Loyalty was purchased through fear or privilege, not shared identity. Eventually, every tribute empire faced the same problem. Expansion stopped, costs remained, and revenue plateaued. When tribute could no longer grow, the system began consuming itself. The economics of conquest worked, until it didn't. And when it failed everywhere at once. Ancient tax systems rarely collapsed quietly. They failed loudly. Through abandoned fields, empty cities, and angry populations pushed past their limits. The first victims were always farmers. When taxes were calibrated correctly, agriculture thrived. When they weren't, the damage spread fast. Overassessment meant farmers surrendered seed grain meant for the next planting. Under pressure, they sold tools, animals, even land. Productivity dropped. Yields shrank. The tax base eroded. States responded the only way they knew how, by raising taxes further. This feedback loop was deadly. In Rome, small landholders were slowly crushed by tax obligations they could not escape. Wealthy elites negotiated exemptions or bribed officials. The burden shifted downward. Farms consolidated into large estates worked by tenants and slaves. Rural populations hollowed out. Cities lost food security. What looked like administrative efficiency was actually decay. In China, dynasties repeatedly fell into the same trap. When central authorities lost accurate land records, corrupt officials inflated assessments. Peasants paid more than they owed. Migration surged, banditry increased, rebellions followed. Each uprising wasn't ideological, it was fiscal. Egypt offers another warning. When officials overestimated Nile yields or ignored bad floods, farmers faced impossible demands. People fled their land. Tax collectors chased ghosts. The state lost both revenue and legitimacy. Bad taxation didn't just impoverish individuals, it destroyed coordination. Cities depended on rural surplus. When farmers collapsed, urban centers followed. Food shortages triggered unrest. Trade slowed. Crafts declined. Armies went unpaid. The state weakened from the bottom up, and taxation was always blamed. Ancient people didn't talk about abstract economic policy. They talked about fairness. A tax system that felt unjust was indistinguishable from tyranny. Once that perception set in, compliance vanished. This is why rulers feared tax revolts more than invasions. Invaders could be fought. Tax resistance meant the state was already dead. A government that couldn't collect reliably could not govern. It lost legitimacy first, then power. The lesson repeated across civilizations. Taxation was not just extraction. It was communication. It told people whether the state saw them as partners or prey. When taxes crossed that line, collapse wasn't immediate, but it became inevitable. Bad taxation didn't kill empires overnight. It starved them slowly, until nothing was left to rule. When ancient tax systems failed, they didn't fail quietly. They failed through revolt. Rebellion was rarely about ideology or ambition. It was about exhaustion. When people reached the point where survival and compliance could no longer coexist, resistance became rational. Paying taxes meant starvation. Refusing meant punishment. At that moment, the social contract shattered. History is filled with these breaking points. In China, nearly every dynastic collapse followed the same pattern. Taxes rose. Corruption spread. Peasants fled or revolted. The state responded with force, which required more revenue, which demanded higher taxes. What began as fiscal strain became civil war. Rome followed a similar path. As imperial expenses exploded, tax pressure intensified. Provinces revolted, not because they hated Rome's culture, but because Rome's demands became unbearable. Tax collectors became symbols of oppression. Loyalty turned into resentment. The empire spent its final centuries suppressing revolts caused by its own revenue needs. Even when revolts failed, they weakened states permanently. Armies consumed resources without producing value. Fields were burned. Trade routes collapsed. Population declined. The tax base shrank further. To compensate, rulers raised taxes again, accelerating the cycle. This is the hidden cost of overreach. Taxation could expand an empire, but it could not save one that ignored limits. Once extraction exceeded capacity, the system turned cannibalistic, feeding on its own foundation. What made this especially dangerous was timing. Tax revolts often erupted during external stress, droughts, invasions, succession crises. The state was weakest, precisely when it needed revenue most. Ancient rulers faced a brutal paradox: lower taxes and risk immediate insolvency. Raise taxes and trigger revolt. Either choice carried collapse. The smartest states avoided this trap by adjusting early. They reformed records, reduced corruption, redistributed burdens, or canceled debts. The worst states doubled down, and history was unforgiving. Empires rarely fell because enemies were stronger. They fell because their own populations stopped cooperating. Once people refused to feed the system, no army could save it. Taxation, which once symbolized power, became proof of failure. By the time revolts became common, collapse was already underway. The state might survive for years, even decades, but its authority was gone. This is the ultimate lesson of ancient taxation. Power is not taken by force alone. It is sustained by consent. And when taxation destroys that consent, even the greatest empires dissolve from the inside out. Ancient tax systems may feel distant, but their logic never disappeared. It evolved. Modern states no longer send scribes into fields or demand grain at city gates. But the core question remains unchanged. Who pays, how much, and for what purpose? Tax design is still a political weapon, just wrapped in paperwork instead of force. The strongest modern states understand this instinctively. They tax in ways that preserve productivity while funding authority. They spread the burden broadly enough to avoid revolt, but selectively enough to protect growth. When taxation aligns with economic reality, compliance follows. When it doesn't, resistance takes new forms. Today, people don't flee farms. They move capital. High earners shift income. Corporations relocate profits. Wealth flows through loopholes instead of caravans. The technology is different, but the response is ancient. When taxes feel extractive rather than reciprocal, people disengage. This is why modern fiscal crises resemble ancient ones more than we admit. Overtax labor and productivity slows. Overtax consumption and inequality deepens. Overtax capital without coordination, and it vanishes. Each imbalance triggers political backlash, economic distortion, or both. Governments face the same paradox ancient rulers faced. They need revenue to function, but the act of extraction weakens the very system that produces it. The solution is not higher rates alone, but intelligent structure, deciding what to tax, when, and from whom. Ancient empires collapsed when taxes punished survival. Modern states destabilize when taxes punish participation. When work, investment, or compliance feels irrational, legitimacy erodes. And legitimacy is everything. People tolerate taxation when they believe it serves stability. They resist when it feels arbitrary, corrupt, or disconnected from public good. This psychological threshold matters more than percentages. History shows this clearly. Empires didn't fall because taxes existed. They fell because taxes broke trust. Once trust disappeared, collection became coercion. Coercion bred resistance. Resistance drained power. That cycle never ended. Today's debates over inequality, wealth taxes, deficits, and fiscal reform are echoes of ancient struggles, arguments over extraction versus sustainability. The tools have changed. The stakes have not. Taxation still decides who rules the world. Not by how much is taken, but by whether the system convinces people it deserves to exist. Empires that forget this don't collapse suddenly. They simply discover, too late, that no one is willing to pay for them anymore.